Good evening. I want to welcome everyone. We're going to give people a few minutes to filter in. If you've just joined, I'm just waiting another minute for people to filter in and then we'll get started. Good evening. If you've just joined, I'm waiting just another minute to make sure everybody can filter in. Okay, we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eileen Brewer. I am the president of Clusterbusters. Welcome to the second week of the Psychedelic Outlaws virtual book club. This evening, we will be discussing the flash discovery of psychedelics for cluster headache, we're going to be discussing chapters 5 through 10 in Psychedelic Outlaws. I am joined this evening by Katherine Ellison. She is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author and co-author of a dozen nonfiction books, including the family ADHD memoir, Buzz, A Year of Paying Attention, if there's time. She will be our moderator this evening. She is joined by author of Psychedelic Outlaws, Joanna Kempner, and characters from the book. Bob Wold, who is the founder and executive director of Clusterbusters, Craig Adams, who is the clusterhead who started the movement, and Dr. Ethan Russo, a neurologist and psychopharmacology researcher. I want to give you a few notes about our session this evening. First, if you have any questions, you can enter them in the chat at any time. You can also discuss things in the chat while we're having the session. We will collect the questions from the chat and feed them to our panel after the presentation part of the evening. First, Joanna is going to read from the book, from the chapters that we're discussing, and then Katherine Ellison will take over the discussion, pose some questions to our panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So we hope you all have a good time. And also, I want to wish all the dads out there a happy Father's Day. I'm going to turn it over to Joanna now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you to Clusterbusters for hosting this amazing virtual book club. And thank you so much. I just want to thank you, everybody. Thanks to all the panelists for coming and making time for us. And especially thank you to Flash, Craig Adams, because it is very late for you right now. So I will just say a few words about what I was trying to do in this section of the book. This was actually just going to be like a small research project at first. When Bob Wold first invited me to a Clusterbusters meeting, this is in some ways Clusterbusters is a very typical what we would call in sociology an embodied health movement, a group that because they need treatment, uses knowledge of their own personal experience, their embodied experience, to challenge science and medicine. There are a number of kind of prominent examples of this, starting with the HIV/AIDS movement. Well, really, we could go back in time to like the Boston Health Collective, Women's Health Collective. I know I grew up with My Body's My Cells on the shelf, which was, a DIY health guidebook for women. So I was like, okay, it's embodied health movement. I'm going to go and write about this. And I went into this first meeting and I was like, okay, well, they're doing something a little bit more challenging. This is an illicit drug. And, maybe there's a little bit something else here. So my very first step, and doing this kind of work online helps since the internet came about. And that's kind of part of what I talk about in this section of the book. Since you need a technology for sharing knowledge quickly, for this kind of movement to really take off. And this is a story. It's a story about the internet. So my first task was to find where it started, which was this post. People would call it like a mysterious post that just popped up on the first few months that there was a cluster headache discussion group. So I went and found that. It was dated July 28th, 1998. And the title of it was, "I Use Small Doses of LSD to Treat Cluster Headache." And there were a few responses. Good luck was, I think, was one of the responses. And then my second step was to kind of just pull that forward. Okay, so there was this post and, everybody's like, okay, be careful, or, good luck. And then that nobody paid attention, really. I think everybody ignored. It was Flash, ultimately. Everybody ignored Flash for a while. And then I was like, okay, so how do you get people to pay attention to him? So I traced that forward all the way up to the moment when they get into Harvard. And, but, as I'm doing this, I'm like, I want to know more about this guy, who goes by Flash. I don't know very much about him. So then, of course, I wanted to go back. I didn't know how to get him. Flash kind of drops. He does a lot of work on this for a long time. But at a certain point, as most people did, they left the group. And I was like, I don't know how to find people on the internet. Who knows where this guy is? But Bob Wold gave me an email. So I'm going to read just a little tiny bit from the, just after I get this email address from Bob. It felt like a gamble when I reached out. To my astonishment, Adams replied, eager to share his story. A few months later, while packing my suitcase to visit him in Aberdeen, my son, age 8, squealed with delight when I told him I was off to meet a man who had discovered that a mushroom helped people in pain. Flash, he said, sounds like a superhero. Flash has a powerful costume for his super ego. Are you wearing your shirt? We can't hear you. It's okay. Flash has a powerful costume for his superhero alter ego. A white Gen X hipster dad wearing straight cut jeans, retro sneakers, and a slim cut t-shirt bearing the logo of Krakatoa, Aberdeen's authentic tiki dive bar and grassroots music venue. Nevertheless, I soon discovered that Flash has several qualities in common with the classic superhero archetype. A tireless energy that powers a compulsion to view even the most intractable problems as a puzzle that he can solve, a moral compass oriented toward the public good, and the resourcefulness, leadership, and courage to carry out his ideas, no matter how batshit they might seem to most people. Luckily for me, Flash is much more comfortable talking about psychedelics now than he used to be. He hasn't had a cluster headache attack in years, so there's been no need to use psychedelic drugs. And it helps that he's financially secure. In the 1990s and early aughts, he worried that his use of an illicit drug would hurt the business he was trying to build. That business is now a multinational company that provides him with a passive income. But he's quick to point out that he's far more of a rebel than the usual tech bro. He's a subversive, an anti-capitalist devoted to redistributing wealth using industrial unions and worker ownership. His ideological orientation is built into the design of his IT company. Rather than replicating conventional hierarchical structures, Flash decided on a much flatter model with share options being distributed among all workers. His belief in this model was so strong that he was taking it even further at Krakatoa, the venue he runs with the Black Cat Collective, a non-hierarchical nonprofit worker cooperative. Free time is spent planning out how to replace Aberdeen's dying oil industry with a more sustainable and circular economy, one built on the network of worker cooperatives. What about the Porsche she drives to work every day? Flash quipped, everyone should have one. Bread and roses indeed. Flash's principles might seem paradoxical, but this blend of innovation and equity made him exactly the right person to launch an underground research network. So I will leave it there and pass it off to Katherine Ellison to get us started.
Thank you, and congratulations on a really amazing book. It was so much fun to read. Flash, you wrote that email in 1998. Why do you? We've since gone through what people are calling a psychedelic renaissance. How much do you think you've had to do with that?
Certainly plenty to do with the cluster headache part. The rest of it, I don't really know. I mean, I guess now that the book's out, perhaps a little more people will know about it. Yes, so it's hard to say.
And why did you call yourself Flash?
Oh, I didn't. The kids at school called me that. It was after the dog from the Dukes of Hazzard. It's because I'm dopey.
Okay, that
It's
was your childhood
sarcastic,
nickname.
like Little John. It's sarcastic nickname.
Okay, so you wrote that one email in 1998. Were you writing other emails in other places, or was it just this was on a listserv, or how did it get to Clusterbusters? I'm a little bit
It was
unsure.
on a bulletin board called clusterheadache.com.
Right.
Um, so I don't know if you want me to go back and give you a little potted history or just deal with that specific question at this point,
Why
I
not
guess.
a little history?
Okay. So yeah, so I had figured out that my headaches were treated with LSD because I hadn't had any for 2 years. And I made a list of everything that I'd done differently those 2 years, because at that point, my life was in a very good place at work and I didn't want to lose the contract that I just won. So this list, I spent hours on it trying to figure out what was different, and it ended up being a really short list. It only had 3 letters on it, LSD. So once I figured this out, I didn't want to go back and take acid again because I'd have to go and get it on the black market, and I wanted to be completely out of that. So I thought I didn't know much about psychedelics, and I thought that LSD was the same stuff that was in magic mushrooms. Um, so it just happened to be September and the mushrooms were out. So I went and I found them. A friend told me where to get them. I managed to pick 600, the most I've ever collected at once in the wild, and tried them with some friends. And the episode never manifest. It was due around then, and it never happened. And
You never had a cluster headache since you took the mushrooms. Is that
oh no,
correct?
I've had cluster headaches and even whole episodes, but far fewer. I mean, I think the only times I've had episodes is where I either wasn't able to obtain mushrooms, or in one instance where I had to destroy them because I thought a neighbor was about to call the cops on me for something else, and I destroyed them, and then I had to endure the whole episode. So and then occasionally at the start of episodes there might be a couple of minor attacks, and that's about it. But in terms of total pain, so I haven't had an attack since 2008.
That's great.
But actually, that's the last time I had to use mushrooms, and it was very mild then. I haven't had a proper full-blown attack since, God, I mean, like maybe 2003
Yeah.
was the last time. So between, say, 1999 and 2008, I must have, say 1993 and 2008, it's 15 years. I'd normally have had, 13 months of cluster headache, and I've probably only had about, what, three?
That's fantastic. So my question before was, you put out that email on the cluster headaches list. Were you telling other people about your experience, or was it just that one communication?
Yeah, so I think firstly, if I just sort of describe what a little bit about cluster headache itself to put this in perspective, because
No,
that's
right. Good
important.
idea.
So yeah, so Cluster headache, how would I describe it? So imagine that a dentist is going to perform root canal on every molar on one side of your mouth, okay? But they're going to do it without anesthetic, and they're going to do it by shoving a red hot poker through your eye socket and rooting around in there at every single teeth. And when people say something's excruciating, I mean, you don't really know what excruciating is until you've had this. We know from people who've had other things and cluster headaches that it's between 2 and 5 times more painful than anything that you would normally consider excruciatingly painful.
Like childbirth, right?
Yeah, like childbirth. So I wouldn't know that though, but I saw my girlfriend go through, and it didn't look pleasant at all. So yeah,
Well, I've
but
had both. I think cluster headache was worse, frankly.
I mean, one of the reasons is because the attacks will last between half an hour if you're lucky and 3 hours if you aren't. And then you might get somewhere between 4 and 8 attacks a day. And that will happen every single day for somewhere between typically 1 month and 9 months if you're episodic like me, or it would happen just every day forever if you're chronic.
Right.
So it's quite a lot to deal with. It's just the sheer onslaught. And when I say per day, I mean half those attacks will be at night. At my peak, I'll be getting 6 3-hour attacks every day for a week at the absolute peak. And my episode was only 1 month long.
So you were unable to work during those times. I mean, how were you coping with them when you got them?
Well, I started getting them when I was at school, because they, like most people with cluster headaches, they come in the spring and the fall. So the spring is round about the time of your exams when you need to be like studying. And the fall is quite near the start of a new term, particularly of university. So I was 16 when they started. I might have actually been 15. I can't remember. It was the spring or the fall of 86. But they were quite mild at first. They were about the level of, I mean, there's no such thing as an average migraine, but if you sort of know what I mean, like that, only lasted about 30 to 45 minutes, probably got about 4 a day. I could tolerate it. And the thing is, nobody believes you. So, there wasn't much I could really do. And I just put up with it when I was at school. It did affect my performance at school for sure. But it wasn't until I was at university that they started to get proper bad. And then by 1991, it was fully developed, if you like. And that was, I think, when my mother started to believe, because I had, during my fall 91 episode, just passed my motorcycle test. I was just 21. And I had a motorcycle in the garage I'd saved up all year for to buy, an old import from Japan. And instead of being out riding my motorcycle, I was in my bed, and even when I finally, a week later, emerged, I really wasn't very well at all and wasn't out in it for long. And I think she knew then, well, this must be serious, right?
It's so hard. I want to ask questions of the other panelists. So I just wanted to get back to that question of how old were you was it 1998 when you wrote that post?
Yeah, so I would have been 20, probably about 28 years old. And yeah, just to, thing I had, by that, around about 92, I dropped out of university because of it. I had a part-time job that I went full-time on at a motorcycle dealer that I really enjoyed. I lost that job as a result of the headaches. And then that was when I was on basically the UK version of welfare. I didn't fill out the forms correctly, so I didn't get the right amount of money. I couldn't afford my rent, and I only had $20 a week left over for food. So it's not a lot. Even then, that wasn't a lot, and that's why I resorted to getting in about LSD. So yeah.
And were you so excited by the fact that, I mean, it sounds like it saved your life and helped you be a success. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Were you telling everybody about it, or were you kind of scared about talking about it?
You'd expect that you might just pick up the threads of your life and get on with it once you had found a solution for it. But when I realized there's a cluster headache message board online, my conscience wouldn't let me not tell other people. I realized the difference that this had made to my life. and the impact it had had on my life was becoming apparent to me then. I thought, no, I've got to let people know. And I knew I was going to be up against it, but I wasn't going to give up until people started to take it seriously.
That's so cool. So I want to move to Bob, because Bob, you were in that agony, and I'm sorry that your headaches have persisted. But when you saw that email in 1998, I mean, everybody always portrays you, and my experience of you is that you're a pretty conservative guy from Illinois, and never would have thought about psychedelics. But how much time elapsed between 1998 and you trying psilocybin yourself?
Well, I was fairly conservative, trying to raise a family and all of that. But I'm a child of the 60s, so I did a little bit of protesting myself in prior years. But yeah, so when Flash's post came up on the message board, I followed along. I wasn't in cycle at the time, so I was trying to find out whether or not this might be worth investigating and hearing about. What's great about the message board for cluster headaches is everybody on the board shares any ideas that they might have that might help them get through the day and survive. So people
How
were
many
all,
things you tried yourself?
how many have I tried?
Yeah, I mean, how many different things had you tried to cope with your headaches?
The first 20 years that I had cluster headaches, I was on over 70 prescription medications in hundreds of combinations. And none of them gave me any lasting relief.
Oxygen
Well,
also,
I,
and
I was given oxygen. I wasn't prescribed it properly. It worked sometimes, but not others. Um,
I've heard of people putting cayenne pepper up their nose.
Yeah, yeah, all sorts of ideas. And there was, eventually there was a clinical study done with, can't remember the name of it, cevitamide or something like that, which is hot peppers basically, and that idea came up on the message board because people had mentioned that just as they're starting to get a cluster headache attack, they take a bottle of Tabasco sauce and dump a teaspoon of it underneath their tongue and let the burning start, and that it was actually helping them get through cluster attacks. And after a while,
Did you
I,
pound your head on the floor also sometimes?
I would, yeah, I mean, it would drop me to my hands and knees. I would bang my head on the floor, trying to knock myself out. For a while, for a couple of cycles or a couple of years, I would run into the shower and alternate ice cold water on my head with as hot of water as I could get. And when I would switch over to the ice cold, I could actually hear my skull cracking and moving. And but it would help a little bit. It would help me get through the attack. It wouldn't shorten it, but it would just give me something else to do. And I've broken ceramic tile in my shower trying to knock myself out, and it just seems like the pain is so substantial that you're past that point where you can't even knock yourself out, or where a body would normally go into shock if you were in an accident, so that you're not feeling pain. It's past that point.
When did you first try psilocybin?
Well, so I had been following some of the posts and the discussion, and it really sounded interesting. And a few people started following up, doing a little bit of research and trying to find out what was really going on and if there might be a connection. And we started to see some connections with some of the headache treatments that were offered to us. And one of them that I'd been on was methosergide, which is actually a modified LSD molecule that had a lot of other molecules attached to it to try to stop it from causing any hallucinations. But they dirtied it up so much that it ended up causing some side effects. So it ended up being taken off the market. But that research had been done on LSD, and they modified that molecule and made a drug out of it. So we started finding out things like that. So the next time I got an attack that my cycle started after Flash had posted his discussion, I let the board know that I really need to try this, and I would really like to try this because nothing's working and I'm going through hell. And one day a package arrived at my front door that had enough mushrooms for 2 doses.
And you're not even sure who delivered that, who gave you those?
Correct. Somebody from the board mailed them to me. But I was in such terrible shape that I couldn't even follow directions, because I was supposed to take half of it for 1 dose and then wait 5 days and take the other dose as a follow-up dose. After I took the first dose, I went through 12 hours without a cluster headache attack for the first time in a month.
Jeez.
My family was outside on the deck, and I walked out an hour after I took them, and I had this giant smile on my face. And it was the first time my family had seen a smile on my face in a month. And so I was headache free for 12 hours. The next day, the cluster started again. So I took the other half of the mushrooms, and I got another 12-hour period cluster free.
Were you hallucinating, or was it like a sub-hallucinogenic dose?
Very, very little. Colors are a little bit brighter. If you look at a flat surface, there's a little waviness. If I looked at the back of my hand, there'd be a little waviness in the skin.
Yeah.
The music sounds a little bit better. Stereo effect is widened. But so all of those things were really kind of pleasant and interesting to do.
Now, if you go on Clusterbusters' website, there's a whole protocol. I mean, really strict, you make a tea, there's all this advice about the tea and when you take it. How
Right.
did you guys figure out that protocol, that might be the best way to do it?
Well, it took a long time and a lot of input from a lot of different people. Myself and Flash and a guy called Pink Shark Mark, who was living in the Dominican Republic but knew an awful lot about mushrooms and science, and input from a lot of other people. And what we were trying to find out was why it was working for some people and not working for others. So, from the very beginning, what really isn't understood about psychedelic research is, it's a big thing now, is they seem to be getting a reputation for not wanting to report any bad results, or results that aren't really good, and are a little picky about the data. But Flash and I both knew that the most important things that we were getting from the people were from the ones that weren't having success, because that's where we could learn.
Yeah.
So we would find out how long people had put in between the doses, if they felt the same thing or if they didn't feel the same thing, how big the dose was, if the hallucinogenic effects, if any, were the same, and what medications they might be on that other people, might not have been on that had success. So it took a lot of work talking to a lot of patients to see what they were doing, because everybody is on a different medication regimen, and they might be on 10 different medications. Half of them, they don't even know what they're supposed to be doing. So it took a lot of work gathering all of that data from the people that weren't having success and trying to figure out what was stopping it from helping some people.
I was amazed by the thoroughness of your website, and how detailed it was and helpful. It's just an incredible research job. But speaking of research, I wanted to ask Ethan, so the Clusterbusters activists managed to get Harvard and Yale to do studies on psilocybin and headaches. At this point in time, what is the best evidence that besides people's testimonials, that this works? Is there a really good research?
That is the best evidence, but what is being described here are concepts that have been apparent to me for decades, and would be to anybody that really researched the literature. Basically, LSD, as people realize, was synthesized by Albert Hofmann in Switzerland, but it was just a molecule that like many others, that came from ergot, a fungus on rye. And so, other drugs mentioned, ergotamine, dihydroergotamine, methysergide, all came from the same research. Ergotamine and methysergide both are psychedelic at very high doses, but as mentioned, methysergide was a drug that helped some people, whether for migraine or for cluster. But I was in practice for 20 years. For 18 years of that, nobody had any major problems with methysergide. But then one woman basically ended up with a blue arm and needed emergency intervention to open up her artery. And then I had another fellow where we discussed all the possible side effects thoroughly, and he ended with a fibrotic heart valve. So it was a very dangerous drug that we only resorted to when desperate. Um, and cluster certainly is an area where people are desperate.
Was pure LSD used to treat headaches in the 1950s? I think I read that.
No, there was research about it. Most of the research had to do with other disorders. I've got a whole book back there that was done in England where they were treating various, what they called neuroses. That word isn't popular these days. One of the neuroses happened to be a young woman with severe psoriasis, which at the time they considered psychosomatic. So, things do change. Anyway, she was cured of her psoriasis, and that's still with LSD. We still would need to understand what happened in her brain with this pharmacological intervention that affected her immunological system,
Wow.
because psoriasis is an immunological disorder.
Well, just to be clear, the evidence, I mean, as far as I can see, the best evidence that psilocybin actually works for headaches right now, academically, is what is it, Professor Schindler at Yale, where she talked to hundreds of people assembled by Clusterbusters, and they all told her they're varying. Is
Yeah,
that
there are
like the
different
best?
levels of evidence.
Yeah.
That level is basically a case series, or even online polls. That tells you something if you've got a large population. But in the medical scheme of things, and certainly for the Food and Drug Administration or other regulators, it's meaningless, because the only thing that counts is what's called a double-blind randomized controlled trial. Um, and
Is
there's a
that
big
right?
problem there,
Yeah.
because you have to, placebo should be something that is indistinguishable by the participants from the real drug. Now, as we've heard, even a low dose of psilocybin or LSD can produce this vibrancy or increased sensations or little wavy lines or those things. You're not going to get that from a placebo that's a sugar pill. You could use other drugs, but there's always the danger that the placebo is not considered a good match, and that
Mhm.
if people can tell what they're taking or not taking, it is considered invalid research. And this is one of the problems that came up with the recent MDMA studies in relation to post-traumatic stress. Even though I will tell you absolutely that those folks were better with their post-traumatic stress due to MDMA. So it would be the same possible problem here. Also, there's another major problem, and this is mentioned and well explained by Joanna in the book, and that is, if somebody is able to take LSD or psilocybin once or a few times and they have a long-term remission, that's not going to be a profitable drug for a company to develop. So economics gets in the way a lot. Another problem is some disorders are so rare, they're called orphan, they're subject to what's called orphan drug status, meaning if there are less than 200,000 people in the United States that have this disorder, and you've got a drug that you've shown is effective, it has a sort of more rapid path to regulatory approval and better patent protection. Unfortunately, cluster is relatively rare, but it's common enough that it doesn't qualify for orphan drug status. That would have been another way that this could have been studied.
But
So
there's no, what you're saying is there's no controlled study, right at this point.
you've just been the studies with the synthetic. Can't
Yeah.
remember the designation. So yeah, at this point, the kind of proof that would be acceptable to the FDA or other regulators just isn't there, despite the fact that people in this group know very well that this works. So it ends up as a DIY exercise, which is crazy that people have to resort to this to get relief when we know that there is something that can help. So this is the kind of frustration I had in my practice, which continues to this day, in light of these kinds of situations. Because the same thing applies to cannabis, where I've done most of my work, but I've always harbored the desire to look at cluster with these agents that could help.
Well, Joanna and anybody else on the panel, what needs to happen for this to get to the next level? I mean, what can people do to break through these barriers?
There's a huge amount we could do, but I just want to jump in really quickly and mention, first of all, just a couple things that Dr. Russo said that I just want to kind of pull on through. The first one is that this has been apparent for decades to anybody who's been observing, and I think Bob can confirm this. So Dr. Russo, one of the reasons that I found you was because you were, somebody reached out to you very early on, early 2000, and because they found work that you had done on this topic. When Bob was going around and talking to various neurologists, you would find everybody knew the story about Albert Hoffman, LSD, methasergide, ergotamine, and they would generally say, yeah, that sounds like it would work. If they didn't throw you out of your office. I mean, there were doctors who, but they didn't want to go necessarily on the record. They weren't excited about studying it. So that was one thing. People knew that this would work, or they thought it would work. They didn't think it was wild that it worked. And in talking to people, to practitioners, like to doctors in the 90s, they had told me that they had other patients who were not Flash, who told them they were using psychedelics to control their cluster headache. So it's not like Flash was the only patient who just stumbled on mushrooms and discovered this happened. The second thing is, most of the, when you asked how we know, like what research is there, almost all of this research has been gathered and pulled together by Clusterbusters. And then even that survey data you were mentioning was pulled together by Marcia Wheel, who I think will be here next week, and handed over to researchers at universities who cleaned it up and helped, and put it in peer-reviewed articles, because as Dr. Russo knows, if you don't have peer review, nobody cares, right? Even though I think it's really key that what Bob had said, that you guys care, you had a pragmatic reason. It was really like, you weren't just like intellectually interested in whether the substance might work. You were in it because you needed it to work. And that there's something epistemologically really interesting about that. It was really important about that. People needed pain relief, and cluster attacks are very painful. When they're coming, right? Like, when you have one. So that was the other thing. And then the last thing I want to say is that this research has resulted in randomized clinical trials, cluster headache and psilocybin, and psilocybin for migraine. They are small randomized clinical trials, but they are now published. So sorry.
They're like pilot, aren't they? preliminary pilot studies that are going to lead to larger studies? I mean, are there larger studies in the works
They're
that would be?
exploratory stories, studies. There's also a study that has been completed that was not blinded in Denmark. And I think there's a study about LSD maybe happening in Switzerland and cluster headache. I don't know where, you probably know the status of that more. Will they lead to bigger studies? You would need a lot more funding for that.
Right.
Mhm.
Yes,
And
it's
even
going
big
on in
pharmaceutical
Switzerland.
companies have trouble getting a randomized control trial done on cluster headache. So,
Yeah.
all right, I just wanted to get all that info.
Yeah. And one disconnect, Ethan, that I'm sensing is that you say, okay, so it's a one-time thing, and I've heard this a lot. So where are the profits? So why should pharma get involved? And yet pharma is getting involved. I mean, supposedly it's multi-billion dollars are going into ketamine and all sorts of other psychedelics.
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of companies that are looking at different indications.
Uh,
But most often, they're looking at conditions where you'd need ongoing treatment. And even so, there's so much competition that it makes it very hard for someone that has the right approach, say for cluster, to get funding. There are only a limited number of grants and a limited number of donors that might have an interest in this area. So it becomes very unwieldy, which is a shame.
hmm.
If I could just jump in
Yes.
here just real quickly.
Yeah.
What Dr. Russo mentioned is really important here, that psilocybin and LSD is actually so effective that you need very few doses. So a pharmaceutical company is not going to spend $300 million on a phase 3
Do the trial.
study and be able to sell 2 pills a year to a cluster
Yeah.
patient,
Exactly.
because at any one time there's probably only 50,000 of us in cycle at any time. So they're going to sell 50,000 pills twice, during the year to people that can use it. So that's a big
And
stopping
yet
point for this research.
billions are going in like for depression and anxiety. And, I mean, I'm wondering if that could lift the boat for if somehow the cluster headache people could jump on that boat.
What's
For
happening?
example, let's see one of those things gets through the FDA process. Chances are it's going to be heavily controlled, and it remains an issue of whether it could be prescribed off-label. In other words, if Bob went into his doctor after a psilocybin treatment for depression was approved, would that doctor be able to write for him? There may be restrictions on it, and this has happened before in relation to Marinol, synthetic THC, was initially quite restricted, and people got in trouble for using it outside of the situation of treating nausea and vomiting with chemotherapy or treating AIDS wasting. So, again, it's the Controlled Substances Act really gets in the way here. Even though this kind of preparation would be in a low dose, it's not addictive to begin with, but these drugs currently are in what's called Schedule 1, which means that they're forbidden, that they're, according to the designation, not reality. They are dangerous, addictive, and have no recognized medical usage. So
Right.
all false in relation to these substances.
Can I just ask Ethan a question that's about the orphan drug status? When I read the book, I discovered about the 200,000 person limit. And I believe the book says, and Joanna can correct me if I'm wrong, that there's roughly 300,000 cluster headache sufferers in the US. Now, what just occurred to me is that of those 300,000 people, probably 2/3 are episodic and 1/3 are chronic. Could
Yeah.
those not be categorized as different separate conditions?
Yeah, maybe, and that's a good thought, but you'd have to take it to have what's called a pre-IND investigational new drug meeting with the FDA to find out. And you really need your proverbial ducks in a row before you arrange such a thing.
Yeah.
So you would need a preparation, you'd need someone backing it, and you need to go through all the bureaucratic hoops.
I can expand on that a little bit, because orphan drug status was applied for for cluster headaches. And it was turned down because there are 300,000 or so in the US. We tried to tell them that if it was just for chronics, you're looking at less than 100,000 people with cluster headaches. And the treatments for chronic and episodic are really different. What works for episodic people doesn't work for chronics and vice versa. So you're really looking at a completely different set of treatment for those two groups. We ended up approaching the person at the FDA that turned down the first status request and made that argument. And he said, the FDA will just look at that as a way for you trying to skirt the rules, and they won't accept that and won't accept the smaller number. Plus, like I said, since we go through, a month or two of these cycles, every year and at different times, there are times in the year where there's probably only 25,000 people suffering from cluster headaches during, July maybe, or August, who knows? But we tried the orphan drug status, and we didn't get past the FDA on that.
I know we're going to move to questions from the audience pretty soon, but Ethan, I wanted to ask you a question on a different topic, which is that you've had some experience with indigenous groups and their knowledge about these drugs. And it seems like in the background of this debate and this whole growing industry, there's also growing demands from indigenous groups and medical journals and UN forums that, I'm hearing calls for reparations and that they should be more involved in setting rules for how psychedelics are used. What do you think about all that?
Well, it's a very complex topic. I worked with the Machigenga or Matsigenka tribe in Peru in Parque Nacional del Menú. This was back in 1995. At that time, we were in the innermost sanctum of the national park, where you couldn't even enter unless you had a government-approved research program or were a member of the appropriate indigenous group. Additionally, because there've been so many bad cases of ripoffs of indigenous knowledge, it's gotten extremely difficult, number one, to get approval for such studies, or number two, cooperation of the folks involved. And then, at the time, I was very interested in setting up a program where any profits or benefits of my research would go back to the tribe, with the idea being to perpetuate indigenous ethnobotanical knowledge, and to maintain the culture rather than have everyone end up with satellite dishes on their hut in the Amazon. But it just didn't come about. I ended up with samples of many plants that seem to have psychedelic properties, where we did preliminary studies to show that they worked on serotonin receptors. We got that far, but we didn't have the funding to do analyses on them to find out what was in them. In many cases, it was DMT, dimethyltryptamine, I'm sure, because this is an ubiquitous molecule in the Amazon and many plants that are used in ayahuasca, or as I noted, as treatments for migraine. I didn't see anyone for cluster there, but it was remarkably effective for migraine treatment.
That's so interesting. Joanna, I did want to ask you about when you compare Clusterbusters to the HIV activists. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, sometimes when people ask me what this book's about, I refer to the Dallas Buyers Club, the movie, and I say it's like the Dallas Buyers Club with mushrooms. So HIV/AIDS patients were desperate, right? And they didn't have anywhere to turn. One of the things I think that is strikingly similar between that group of patients and people with cluster headache, as opposed to people with severe migraine, is that when you get diagnosed with HIV, you have a period of time before you get really, really sick, but you know it's coming, right? And you can see your friends. There's a like, again, a really strong pragmatic reason to do a lot of activism to learn everything you can. Cluster headache is very similar in that way. Even in between attacks, there's a period of time of feeling okay before that next attack comes. I think in contrast with migraine, the sicker you are, the people who have been most invested in this, they have a lot of, they're kind of sick all the time. And it becomes a little bit, and I mean, it's a different embodied phenomenon. So with HIV AIDS, what people did was they became scientists themselves. A lot of them were, they were living in San Francisco and New York or big cities. A lot of them already had a lot of education. And that's not, what they were basically able to read science, learn the language of science, and engage with scientists. And when they went and they protested how the FDA, they protested how the FDA was doing clinical trials. They were very angry about FDA rules. And they made sure, I'm pretty sure that that's where breakthrough technology, but the breakthrough indication label comes from.
Yeah. Huh.
That we, see applied now to MDMA and psilocybin, and most recently actually for LSD. So they were able, and there's a kind of mandate to always include somebody from the patient community in review panels. That comes from the HIV/AIDS community activism, where they were just so, it was the intense need to change how the science was done.
Yeah. And then just one last question for Bob. That I've been very curious, being head of Clusterbusters. How much did you worry that you'd get busted as far as arrested while talking about all of this?
Well, personally, I wasn't worried at all. I was worried that my family was worried.
Huh.
And
were you not worried because you just were so desperate?
Well, in the early days on the message board, there were some people that were actually suggesting that I try to get arrested so I could end up on Oprah Winfrey's show and get us some publicity. I didn't think that was a very good idea, but I'm in Chicago. Back then, one of the largest newspapers in the country was the Chicago Sun-Times. And I ended up kind of a cover story. The health reporter wanted to do a study on, or a story of cluster headaches and psychedelics. The word psychedelics was what drew him to the story, but then it ended up really a story really about cluster headaches. And that was really typical of a lot of reporters and people. They would think that psychedelics was the big part of the story, and then they would actually find out what cluster headaches are. So this 2-page story ended up on the front page or back page of the Sun-Times with a picture of me by my pond, and explaining to everybody that I grew mushrooms in my house, and then I took 2 maintenance doses, one on the 4th of July and one on the New Year's Eve. And so all the evidence was there out of my own words, that I was growing illegal mushrooms and what day they might want to stop by to see when I was using them. One of my kids actually knitted a door knocker for the front door that had DEA on it to welcome the DEA, because they thought for sure I was about to get arrested. But I never was approached by any law enforcement other than local law enforcement that knew me and would high-five me when they knew I was dosing.
Wow.
But I never got an email. There were a lot of psychedelic websites that were being shut down over the years, talking about using psychedelics. A lot of people were getting in trouble for that sort of thing. But
have any cluster headache sufferers been in trouble?
There have been a couple. One was stopped while he was driving, and I don't know. the police asked if he had any drugs in the car, and he's just mentioned, well, it's just the magic mushrooms that I use to treat my cluster headaches. So I don't know if he's out of trouble yet or if he's still fighting that, but that was the
Wow.
last time. But there have really only been a couple, but I've never gotten an email or a phone call or a notice from any government agency to stop what we were doing.
Hmm.
So, and I was ready for that fight if they did. So, just,
Joanna, how hopeful are you that with cities beginning to legalize? I mean, it seems like for a while there was some energy there and then it kind of petered out. But do you think that cities will start legalizing, psychedelics for medical therapy, just like they did with medical marijuana?
Cities and states are moving on legislation, and Clusterbusters is very, very active in this. Eileen Brewer, our host, can speak to this better, I think, than anybody on the panel, or Kevin, one of the other. So if one of you wants to take a stab at that answer, I know that you're both really, really know more than anyone about this.
What was the question?
It was about can we, I think mostly like how much can we rely, like where are the kind of like city and state
how hopeful are you
changes?
that the movement for cities to legalize psychedelics is going to go anywhere?
That's a really complicated question. I am hopeful. However, I think what we've seen so far is mostly conversations more about mental health than physical health conditions. Like in Oregon, you're required to go to a healthcare center to see a provider to obtain the substances or psilocybin in that case, and have the experience. So for a clusterhead who would have to do that every 5 days or whatever, that becomes like unapproachably expensive. Like we just don't have the time to stop life every 5 days and go sit in a therapist office for 6 hours. Or however long they require you to be there. Colorado also has passed some laws, and they're a little bit different. So it's a little more hopeful there, but still it's pretty restrictive. And then DC has deprioritized psilocybin containing products, which means that they exist on the gray market. The gray market's great. Unfortunately, it's created its own problems of nobody is testing the products. We don't actually know what's in them. So everybody, like lots of states are trying all of these different things. Some states just have research bills where they're giving money to research institutions to look into different things about how psychedelics work. And then some states like New York and New Jersey have legislation that is going to advance access for people, and it's in a variety of ways. New York so far is my favorite bill because it would mean real access for real legal, as much as legal can be, access for people with cluster headache. It would look a little bit more like medical cannabis legislation around the country. None of these things go all the way though, because ultimately all of these substances, cannabis included, they are federally illegal. And that means that if you wind up on the wrong side of the law for whatever reason, they can still prosecute you for just simple possession federally. It doesn't happen very much, but it can happen. And so, especially for people whose jobs involve whatever's going on federally, they're still not going to have access because they're going to be too worried about other things going on. And worldwide, there's a variety of policies as well. The UK has been trying to have access to psilocybin for quite some time too, and they've moved forward and then moved back. And it's a really complicated issue. I would really like to change things in a different way, but that's where we are.
we can see how well or how not well a patchwork system of access to care might operate now that we no longer have nationwide access to reproductive services like abortion, right? So if you want to see what that looks like in, you know, in a if you want to increase access to care for people in pain, then I think going low, you know, in this incremental way, like it's the only way we have. Another problem here, which a couple of panelists have mentioned, is that medicine now is regulated by the FDA, but the Drug Enforcement Agency has is able to regulate controlled substances, and their rules then dictate a whole range of issues that aren't just about criminalization, but are also about freedom of inquiry to study particular substances and about development, right? And so like if a Schedule I drug, it's you can't take tax deductions. So it has all kinds of knockdown effects. This kind of bifurcated system is one thing that I think we could probably do a little bit better with.
Sounds like a lot better. Is it time to open it up to questions? I see a lot of questions accumulating on chat.
Sure. Let's see. The first question that I saw was for Dr. Russo. You mentioned in the book that there was an eye drop and you thought that it contained DMT. We typically talk about mushrooms, LSD, etc. So an eye drop is a different method than typically talked about.
Yeah, well, there'd be one problem straight out of the chute. If someone's in the midst of an attack, it means that one side is unavailable. The cluster sufferer is not going to be able to open their eye on that side and will have tearing. So you wouldn't be able to get it in. There'd be the possibility of doing it intranasally on the side that wasn't pouring out mucus. You would not be able to take it orally because dimethyltryptamine is not active orally unless there are other ingredients like the harmine and harmaline alkaloids that come from Banisteriopsis caapi, the vine of the soul. But this kind of thing could help acutely. I saw in the chat that apparently DMT doesn't work in chronic cluster situations. I'm wondering if repetitive doses might be a little bit different. So I think that DMT approaches would be extremely helpful in migraine, but maybe less practical for cluster.
Yeah,
It's
Ethan,
unfortunate because this is in nature a very common molecule.
when we were at the conference just a couple of weeks ago, we're speaking about this with researchers, and they were explaining that the reason that the likes of BOL 148 and LSD and psilocybin are effective at breaking the cycle is because they grip the receptor really strongly, whereas DMT doesn't. But what DMT can do is abort individual attacks.
Sure. Another thing would have to do with half-lives, how long the drug lasts in the blood. And DMT is a very short-acting drug. If someone smokes it, they have a trip for 20 minutes or so, as compared to LSD, which is, you know, up to 12 hours. So that can be another factor. This prolonged exposure of the receptors, whether it's serotonin 2A or whatever, that can make a difference. So yeah.
Does the MEO make it stay in the receptors for longer, or does it just help it get through the stomach?
That one can be orally active, so that's 5-methoxy DMT. Very different drug. Even in heavy doses, it's sort of like trip without the visuals. So there's the exploding head feeling and thought processes, but no visual changes. A very strange drug. Yeah, I really don't have enough experience with it to know if it would be better in this context. What have the group members said about that?
we know that LSA works, which is like that as well. It doesn't give you much in the way of visuals, but most people don't find it particularly pleasant because it's just all of kind of the bad parts of the trip, I guess. None
Yeah,
of the benefits.
Yeah.
sure. So that's for people who were not familiar. That's just lysergic acid without the diethylamide. So that would be a natural molecule that's present in like Hawaiian wood rose and morning glory seeds, whereas LSD was synthetic. It's started with base molecules. It started with lysergic acid, but then was made into a synthetic and much, much more potent.
And I just want to throw out what anybody's thoughts about ayahuasca would be in this context.
Okay, so ayahuasca is a mixture that's used by indigenous people in the Amazon and now in some Western countries. It is dimethyltryptamine, usually from the Psychotria plant. Those leaves combined with Banisteriopsis caapi, a vine that has material in it that prevents the breakdown of DMT in the gut, which is normally what happens. So it makes it orally active. That's going to last about 3 hours per dose. It might or might not be better than the approaches I described with the Machigengo would use eye drops to treat headache or to increase their hunting prowess. So again, it would remain to be seen. However, I can say about the ayahuasca that that's a rough ride. Almost everyone is going to get sick and vomit with it, and it's a very intense experience, at least at the doses that people use traditionally. So it's a very, very heavy trip, and one that would, I think, should only be done in a ritual context. But certainly, at minimum, someone needs a guide who's experienced and not partaking at the time because it can be extremely difficult. Trial by fire. So, the approaches in contrast that people describe using low doses or micro doses of LSD or psilocybin mushrooms are very benign experiences that aren't going to pose any of these same problems.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is about concerns about the question is any concerns about BOL 148? Would it be prone to similar complications as Sansard or methysergide? And like what have experiences in the community been so far as the potential complications? So I guess that's Dr. Russo and also Bob. Like, I guess you guys could.
I can give a little history on that, and Dr. Russo could pick up on anything. But so there was a small study done in Germany on cluster headaches with BOL 148, which is a modified LSD molecule, and it was almost 100% effective for breaking cycles after people had 2 or 3 doses. What's really interesting.
Can you say what BOL 148 is?
Did I say what it is?
Yeah.
It's a modified LSD molecule. It just has some other.
Sorry, you did say that. I just
yeah.
It's not psychoactive though, is it?
No, it has a bromide molecule attached to it, so that it stops it from being psychoactive. Although, if you have enough of it, it can be psychoactive, just like methysergide was. The difference between side effects with BOL 148 and methysergide is methysergide was given every day. People that were on it took methysergide every day for the entire length of their cycle. Sometimes they would stay on it even when they weren't in cycle, so that they would stay on it. So they would be on it while they're waiting for the next cycle to start. BOL 148 is given 2 or 3 times and you're done. So you only use it a few times, and there really are no safety concerns. It's been used as a placebo in other research studies, the safety of BOL 148 is widely known and researched. And once again, it's only used a few times versus being taken every day.
And I guess
So-
it passes a double blind as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So at the doses that we use for cluster headaches, you can, because most people don't even know that they've taken anything. So, and most of the medications that we take for our clusters, we feel some pretty terrible side effects to begin with most of the things that we take. So it's probably, feeling less benign than most of the things that we take for our clusters.
The main drawback I would see is that we're not getting the other benefit of LSD in terms of how it helps with PTSD and stuff like that.
Correct. And I mentioned that years ago at a conference, was that, if we ever get BOL out to the market and available to people and they use it, I would still suggest that they dose with psilocybin or LSD afterwards to treat their post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, anxiety, and everything else that comes along with living with this disorder for 20 or 30 years. Because there are marked improvements among the people with cluster headaches that use psychedelics for their own mental health. And that's at low doses, not sitting talking 8 hours to a psychologist or a therapist and sitting there for a couple of hours with their spouse or their family and laughing for an hour and crying for an hour and feeling a lot better. Sometimes the best therapist is the one that you're married to. So, yeah, so I would still suggest, if you get BOL, you're going to want to follow that up with some psilocybin down the road.
Or vice versa,
Or vice versa, yeah.
whichever.
Yeah.
I'm looking to see if are there any further questions. Did I miss anything? I don't think that I've missed anything. I do want to shout out that somebody asked earlier if breakthrough therapy status is a way to get around actual FDA approval. And it isn't. It's just a way for the FDA to kind of fast track the process and focus on it. There isn't really any way around FDA approval. And that kind of speaks to the fact that the FDA might be a little broken.
No.
I'd be really ask Joanna, what has been the feedback that you've gotten from the book, which has just been out a little while?
Well, people seem to really like it. I'm really happy to bring a new slice of history to the psychedelic world. I think that in particular, focusing in on this like mid 90s to 2010 period when the internet is really helping consolidate knowledge and bring things above ground is really important. But the most gratifying thing to me is hearing from people who have been, see themselves in the book. So that's why I think that's why we write, isn't it? Right. So that's
And the movie is planned for
oh, we're not gonna talk about that.
Are you continuing to research along these lines, or do you have another?
I still have quite a lot of data and history to write. I'm an academic, I'm a professor, so things will be coming out in articles and things, that I still have a lot more going on here. There's so much more story to tell. So
I bet there is. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
All right, well, we're at time. I want to take a moment to really thank Katherine Ellison for joining us and facilitating this conversation, and all of our panelists, Craig, Ethan, Joanna, Bob, for being here this evening and having this great conversation. And a special thanks to Joanna for writing this wonderful book.
Us.
Well,
Yep.
thank you for having me. I hope you guys come back next week and we'll hear all about the Harvard days.
Oh, boy. I can't wait to relive that.
Just don't
Yeah.
wear a wire.
All right.
Yeah, I might mute myself for that one.
Looking forward to it. I won't be here next week, but Kevin will be your host next week. I'll be off doing other things. So I hope you all have a good week. We'll see you next week.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Sure.
Good seeing you, Flash.
You too.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.